Ruta Sepetys is an internationally acclaimed #1 New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction. Her work has been published in over 60 countries and 40 languages. Winner of the Carnegie Medal and honored by the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Ruta is renowned for giving voice to underrepresented history and those who experienced it. Welcome to the first 50 pages, Ruta.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your first books, including Between Shades of Grey and Salt to the Sea, are quote-unquote cataloged as young adult books. But we would really consider you kind of a crossover novelist, in our opinion, I guess, as librarians, because both students and adults worldwide are your readers. Your young adult novels explore hidden history and stories of oppression, but your debut adult novel, A Fortune of Sand, looks at history through a slightly different lens. Can you tell us a little bit about what readers can expect in A Fortune of Sand?
Like you said, while my young adult work focuses on young people who are fighting oppression, my adult work will kind of turn its lens toward, things that were once vital but have vanished. So people, places, products that once, ruled the world, but now lay sort of buried or forgotten. And my book, A Fortune of Sand, is set in Detroit in the 1920s when Detroit was considered the Paris of the Midwest, the Gilded Age of Detroit. And the story follows Marjorie Lennox, who is an automotive heiress, and she discovers a secret within her own family. And the story explores just how far will an American dynasty go to keep their secrets.
I think that one of the first things that stood out to me in reading A Fortune of Sand was the setting. You truly bring us into Detroit during the Prohibition era through your descriptions of the places, the fashion, and especially the language that the characters use. The way they talk to each other was really fun, And as a reader, you truly feel transported to this time and place of glamour and grift, as you said, in Detroit's golden age. So what was the spark that inspired you to write this story?
Well, the spark, I was born in Detroit and spent a lot of time at my grandparents' home, which for anyone listening, if they are a Michigander, which was around 6 Mile and Woodward, near the edge of Palmer Park. Not a very humble area, let's just say. But when I was 9 years old, I had the opportunity with my parents to visit a colleague of my father's, and she was the fashion writer for the Detroit News. And she lived in one of these, storied, gilded mansions. She used to live in our neighborhood and she had just moved in. And so as a 9-year-old, here I went, with my parents and discovered that some homes in Detroit and Grosse Pointe, they had hidden speakeasies. They had underground tunnels. And can you imagine, even as 9-year-old me, this was so exciting. Being in this mansion where, the walls speak and the floors creak and the windows rattle on the wind. And it was full of story. And it stayed with me from the time that I was 9 years old. Also, what determines how history is preserved and recalled? I often wondered, why are these stories of glamour and crime? We see them, New York, Chicago, even Las Vegas, let's say, but not Detroit. So it was this uncombed historical wilderness. But the spark was that first visit when I was a child to that mansion.
You talked a little bit about kind of our main character of the book, Marjorie Lennox, and I thought she was such a great character.
Oh, thank you so much. I really researched women quite a bit during that era because the 1920s is known as a bit more of a era where, people were so free and it was the roaring 20s. But when you look beneath the surface, yes, there were certainly glamorous and glitzy parties, but this was a time when women were still truly suffering. And I wanted to create a character who wants to seize agency and power during a time when the world is determined to deny women of that agency and power. So I read a lot of journals from women of the time period. I listened to different old vintage recordings and radio recordings. As you talked about, there's a poetry of phrasing for every different era. And the way people spoke, this era definitely had this quippy click, and snap to it. And I wanted to capture that. But mostly, a story of women for women and what happens when a woman doesn't neatly fit into a gilded frame.
Of course, A Fortune of Sand is not just historical fiction. It's romance and mystery and more. And kind of like you've touched on, it explores deeper themes, one of those being how women struggled to find agency in this time period. Of course, one of the fascinating rabbit holes I went down was the story of the Eloise Asylum, which, for our listeners, was a real place. It seems that any woman living in the area that was behaving badly at that time was threatened with being institutionalized. Did your research for this book uncover any new truths for you about the Eloise Asylum?
So many. And for people living in Michigan or even in Ohio, Eloise was this dark shadow. My own mother and aunt whispered of Eloise Asylum and, people who may have been sent there or they heard, or this neighbor, or what I didn't know was the sad truth that so many women were involuntarily committed to Eloise. That if the husband wanted to get rid of them, it was like, I think you might not be all there. You're having these thoughts, these, I don't know, very interesting thoughts. I think you might need to be committed. And there were so many tragic stories. I stumbled upon a story about women in a neighborhood. Their friend, her husband had taken up with another woman and he wanted to get rid of her. And so he had her committed to Eloise. And these women, who were actually part of a reading circle, coincidentally enough, got together and they fought back. And they fought back all the way to court and went to court and they lost. The judge, ruled that, well, no, a wife is a man's chattel and he can make this decision for her. And so I thought a lot about that, about women's agency, also in relation to creativity, right? So in A Fortune of Sand, Marjorie is an aspiring designer and she's a seamstress. And she is accepted to this very exclusive arts residency where she meets other women. She meets a painter, she meets a furniture designer, who I based loosely on Florence Knoll, who was an orphan from Michigan and became a very, very well-known designer. There's a playwright there. And during this time, this was just not accepted for women to be in the arts in this way. And I wanted to explore that a bit.
And I think it kind of just brings home the idea of kind of, you mentioned already that like the Roaring 20s, like you feel like we have this romanticized version of like what that decade or what that era means. And really, this is kind of like the underbelly of that. And
exactly. Stories like this, of these worlds that were once so vital and have now vanished, they hold this elasticity, this fragile tension, right? Of like I say, when everything is still, when the world's dancing, but it's all going to come to a crashing halt. And I love, as a writer, I love that fragile tension.
I loved the like bits of like name dropping that you used throughout the book. It really kind of made the whole story come alive even more for me. That, you mentioned Jack Dempsey and Harry Bennett, Cutter Bell, Harley Earl, Susan Langland. I found myself, looking up their stories and then wanting to learn more about them, which really just brought even more context to this period. Was there a figure that you included whose story you found particularly fascinating?
I spent 13 years. Yes, you can laugh at me. I'm ridiculous. I spent 13 years, you guys, building this story from bricks of actual things that happened. As eccentric as some of the details might seem. Oh, the parakeet, the umbrellas with names. They're all from real stories that I dug up. But you mentioned Harry Bennett, and I'm so glad you did. There was this very rare book called We Never Called Him Henry, and by Harry Bennett. And Harry was Henry Ford's kind of, I mean, now we would probably say he was, a bodyguard. Back then they called him, he was in charge of, personnel or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
This book was chock full of details. And, Harry Bennett, as he aged and retired, so to speak, he lived his life in seclusion on a hill, camped out. I mean, absolutely certain that someone was coming for him. So these automotive barons, I mean, this was such a competitive business. It was like its own world of gangsters, right? And Harry Bennett, that book that he wrote, there were so many details that also peeled back the layers of the relationship between Henry Ford and his son Edsel, and then the Dodge brothers, and what happened to these raucous, Dodge brothers who, oh my goodness, they were titans of industry. And within a matter of a couple months, they both died. And there was a lot of fear and trepidation and competition. It was a very interesting time. So yes, all of that history, every name that is dropped, so to speak, is based on actual happenings, actual people that I just didn't want to slip through the cracks of history.
We are librarians, and we have a local history librarian at our library. And one of, I think, the most fun things that we have in our library are some of these local history displays that she does. She goes into clip files, and she's done like true crime. She's done, even we're having like a 100-year
history of like the Sioux City Garden Club. And
so she's fine. I mean, it is so very interesting to have that kind of at our fingertips to find that. And at the end of the book, you include some of those newspaper headlines that you came across in your research for the story. And it was such a treat at the end of the book to kind of get to look at those. And it also made me think about the media, like you say, how it has evolved and how maybe it hasn't. Those sensational headlines sell newspapers, and the rich and powerful work to keep their names out of those headlines. But it also the investigative journalism and the probing questions that work to uncover corruption. And I don't think I have a question here, but I think it's such an intriguing thing to think about. And it would really make a great book club discussion.
Oh, well, but you're touching upon so many things that that excite me. First of all, your library and the displays. Did they do one on the buttons, the button capital of the world, Iowa, the Sioux City, and I mean, just incredible history that you have. And the other thing about the media, which you touched on. Remember, back in the day, newspapers. I mean, this was a big business, printed newspapers, and there were newspaper wars. And interestingly, you mentioned the ability of prominent families to keep things out of the news. And to that point, it was on one of my morning reads with my coffee that I decided I'm going to read the New York Times. And I think it was like 3 pages in, there was a story about a jewel heist from the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I had not read about that. Why was that not in the Detroit papers? And I went back and I thought, I wonder if there's a mistake here. And then I dug deeper and deeper. And I think sometimes I'm more of an investigator than a researcher. And it turns out that, yes, there was this massive jewel heist, a 12-foot case of the Frederick Stearns collection that had been donated to the Detroit Institute of Arts. They were stolen and they were replaced with fakes, with glass fakes. And this was not in the Detroit papers. And so, of course, my brain starts to tick. Why not? What are they hiding? And do you know that as I tracked this down and I even contacted the Detroit Institute of Arts, there was a long delay before they responded, which is understandable. They're very busy. But when they responded, they said, Ruta, we don't know about this.
Oh.
And I said, well, I'd like to come. I'd like to see, the jewels. I tracked this down and I read and I was giving my sources and all the articles. And I put in FOIA requests. I worked with the FBI. I heard everything. And I said, well, here's the proof that the jewels have been were returned. And they said, well, we can't locate the jewels. What? Oh my goodness. And so that plays a large role in the plot with Marjorie Lennox.
Yeah.
Who is adjacent to this story at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I just so appreciate your comment that, there's the news we know and there's the news we don't.
Yeah.
Kind of keeping in theme with our, I guess, newspaper discussion, obituaries kind of really became a lot bigger during this time and were really, kind of flourishing as not just like so-and-so died and like that was it, And of course, I love how fierce you made Chet at her job, capturing the life stories of Detroit's recently departed. What prompted you to give such importance to obituaries within this story?
Oh, well, you nailed it. During this time, obituaries, people were very proud of their obituaries, whether it was for their husband or for their dog. It was a very interesting time. And what people, and then they would oftentimes, I noticed as I was reading the newspapers, they would print a correction to the obituary. Saying, actually, no, that isn't quite right. And I really loved the idea when I was researching these automotive families and how the daughters were being, married off and these arranged marriages with, other dynasties. And then there were these women like Marjorie, like Chet, who just weren't going to fit that mold. And I started thinking, as I was reading some of these bizarre obituaries, who is writing these? And how are they researching these? And why are families writing, oh, you must retract that, and arguing the obituaries? And so I had the idea of this really wonderful and unique, quirky woman who writes obituaries, but under the guise that it's her brother who's actually the writer. And Graham, their brother, who is the heir, right? He's the heir of this Lennox glass fortune. This family we haven't discussed. They make windshields. And so imagine like Downton Abbey in Detroit, but with a family of talented Mr. Rickleys. This family, they're like a bunch of shysters, which I learned through my research. So here Graham decides, I think I want to pen a salacious novel. So it would be good practice for me to write obituaries. But then he quickly gets bored with it. And Chet decides, wait a minute, Charlotte, they call her Chet, I'm going to write these. And she becomes so invested, in it. And whether it's Chet exploring her own grief or it's her way to cope, that's a whole nother book club discussion, as you say. But I loved writing that character of Chet, who is entirely her own personality within this, like I say, family of talented Mr. Ripleys.
Thank you for writing such wonderful books and giving voice to those hidden histories. And thank you for such a wonderful conversation today, Ruta.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
The First 50 Pages is a collaboration between the Sioux City Public Library and Siouxland Public Media. Find all of our podcasts at kwit.org. I'm Mark Munger, and this is Siouxland Public Media.